Okay, I think we're going to start with the introduction, and then as we have more people coming in, they can start participating. So just a few rules, just to go through them again. Please mute yourself unless you're speaking, and also turn off the video unless you're speaking again, just to save bandwidth. We're going to have a question and answer session in the third part of the webinar. You can either post your questions on the chat box, or you can also raise your hand. There's a button where you can show hand, and then you can unmute yourself and even turn on your video to pose the question to either one speaker or all. You can have, it would be great to have your Zoom name on the box, and if you have any problems, please contact Ida, my colleague Ida. You can message her privately, or just even write in the chat box that there's some issue that you're facing. Okay, wonderful. So a very good afternoon or good evening to everyone joining us at the webinar. I am Mahin Khan, and I will be moderating the panel session in the webinar today. Welcome to the second installment of the Voices from the Frontline webinar. To briefly outline, Voices from the Frontline is an initiative by ICCCAD in ICCCAD in partnership with GRP. Through the initiative, we have been documenting, learning, and sharing stories of community resilience from across the globe. And as such, we are witnessing, as we publish these resilience stories, that communities are self-organizing to support the most vulnerable. These stories have led to a number of advocacy messages that are emerging, and we are constantly working with various partners to shape and reshape them. Some of the advocacy messages are, as you can see on your screen, these are all the advocacy messages that we are currently working with, and they're constantly evolving as we publish more and more stories with time. I'm just going to quickly go through the advocacy messages one by one. So the first advocacy message is grassroots organizations play a proactive role in closing development deficits that compound vulnerability during times of crisis, and they are often overshadowed. Second, caring for the most vulnerable is a right and not a charitable activity. Governments should partner with empowered local grassroots structures to ensure this right. Third, grassroots organizations are trusted knowledge brokers and provide important channels of trusted information at times of high misinformation. Security of migrants deserves special attention in times of crisis. They are especially vulnerable, but also essential for resilient local economies. COVID-19 recovery investments should amplify initiatives that bring together community resilience, nature, and climate, thereby addressing root causes of vulnerability. Grassroots organizations can play a critical role in maintaining resilient rural-urban food supply chains and livelihood opportunities during disruption. And today, the focus of our webinar would be on the role of women and youth. And this advocacy message is women and youth provide essential leadership during crisis despite their vulnerabilities. All these advocacy messages have been emerging from the stories that we have been publishing. They will be subject to change as we publish more stories in the future. Okay, so we are joined today by diverse speakers at the panel who will be speaking and discussing about their work with women and youth and how the local organizations in their communities have adapted during the pandemic to cater to demanding needs. The panel will be opened by Suranjana Gupta. Suranjana is an advisor at the Wairu Commission. The Wairu Commission is a women-led social movement of grassroots groups from poor, urban, rural, and indigenous communities in more than 45 countries. Suranjana, I give you the floor to open the session today.
Thank you, Mahin. Thank you so much for inviting me to this session. Let me quickly move to my remarks so that I don't go over the time that I've been allotted, which I think I tend to do. But to begin with, I was told that one of the important things that people wanted me to reflect on was the blog that Sheila Patel and I wrote on new narratives for the new normal. Why are we talking about grassroots women's organizations as leaders rather than focusing on their vulnerabilities? So I wanted to come back to that idea and emphasize the idea of why do we need to talk about their leadership, and why do we have to talk about them as active agents of change. Certainly that's where their power and their collective power comes from. When we look at and when we examine the kinds of active roles that they are playing and the way in which they are the first responders to a crisis, but also they're drawing on the skills, capacities, relationships, and resources that they have built up over a long period of time in the past. So, one of the reasons I think it's very important to look at roles is that when we start looking at what active roles grassroots women's organizations are playing, we start to look at their functions, and we start to value the resources that they bring to problem solving. So that's one part of it. And as we continue to examine these roles, we also start looking at how the roles are changing, how grassroots women are redefining their roles, how their roles are being perceived by others, and how institutions are nurturing or affirming or challenging the public roles that grassroots women are playing here in the case of crisis, but it could be equally applicable to their roles in the work that they're doing on development. So the importance really is on examining their active roles in shaping, in this case we're talking about the COVID crisis, in shaping the response to the COVID crisis. So let me give you two examples of the ways in which their roles are pushing us to revisit some of the ideas of women's roles. So the first role, I think, which we are seeing again and again in the work that we are doing in many countries, we are seeing women's role as mobilizing their communities to take care of the most vulnerable. So what we are saying is, it's not that women have to be constantly looked at as through the lens of vulnerability, but organized women's groups are now promoting a sense of community caregiving, which is quite different from other ideas. I mean, a lot of literature talks about women and unpaid care work, which is primarily in the home, which is part of women's social roles, which they are socialized to play. Another part of the discussion on caregiving talks very much about institutional care, the kind of health care or the service provision that is provided by a set of different institutions. Usually, I mean, these are formal institutions, whether these are institutions for palliative care, for health care, for child care, and so on. But this is community caregiving, where they are actually mobilizing their societies, communities, and neighborhoods to take care of the most vulnerable. And it's imbued with some sense of values around compassion and caring, not only entitlements, but includes the idea of getting entitlements. And I think there are many factors that come into this caregiving, which include issues of pressing local governments to make communities safer, looking at conflict resolution things. So it's a much broader idea of community care that grassroots women are mobilizing. And I think it becomes particularly relevant in terms of the migrant crisis, where thousands of migrants are either refugees in some cases, which we'll hear about, but also where in the case of India, thousands of migrants have returned to their villages and don't have a support structure. The other role that I quickly want to mention is the idea that women's groups are basically making social protection work for those who really need access to government resources and government safety nets. So there's a huge discussion about shock responsive social protection, but this focuses primarily on the supply side and how the government is designing mechanisms, how they deliver these mechanisms, and so on. But in this case, when you talk about the shock responsiveness, women's groups are the ones, in many cases, you know already that they're supporting governments to target beneficiaries. They're supporting people to access the programs. And they're also providing the much needed support in the interim period between the time that people try to access these programs and they actually kick in. So for example, let's say providing food until food assistance from the government kicks in, or some kind of cash support or healthcare support. So in effect, they're the ones who are making shock responsive social protection particularly responsive to the most vulnerable. The last point I'm going to make in my remarks just now is the idea that women can naturally do something. And I keep hearing this in a lot of discussions, and I think people mean well when they say women are naturally better at this, good at that. I find it very problematic because I think that it undervalues the amount of investment and work that has gone into nurturing the leadership roles of grassroots women, and nurturing their relationships with among different groups across networks, their relationships with government. All that takes a tremendous amount of work and investment, and none of that comes naturally. So I think that it's very important to understand that if we want to promote these roles, the kind of long-term intensive investment that's needed over time to actually nurture and promote grassroots women's leadership. And it also becomes very important in the context that in the last 10 years, we can see that a lot of civil society space and the space for social movements is shrinking in many countries. So let me stop there, and I hope that's enough food for thought.
Thank you so much, Suranjana, for kickstarting the panel and opening with such powerful messages about the roles of women in society, and especially during crisis. So we are going to start the panel discussion, and we are joined by the speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them and hand it over to them to talk about their work. So we are joined today by Nadia Cetas. Nadia is a senior researcher at Center for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The center works on the theory and practice of resilience and transformations and/or transitions. Lydia Schiaparani is the head of media and advocacy at Irida Women's Center in Thessaloniki, Greece. The center provides its members with resources to help heal the effects of trauma. A majority of the beneficiaries are refugees, migrants, and asylum-seeking women and their children. And finally, we are joined by Krishna Khatka. He is the chairperson at the Youth for Environment, Education, and Development Foundation in Nepal. It is an organization of young individual people working with the rights of youth, including indigenous youth in the country. And of course, the panel will also consist of Suranjana. Well, let's start. We are going to start with Lydia. Why don't you take the floor?
Thank you very much, Mahin. Hello, everybody. I'm Lydia Schiaparani. I'm the head of media and advocacy, as Mahin said, at Irida Women's Center in Thessaloniki. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all today and participating in this very fruitful dialogue and sharing the experiences I have gained so far by working closely with refugee women from across the world. So Irida Women's Center was established in 2018 and work closely with refugee migrant and asylum-seeking women who live in the urban area of Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki is the second largest city in Greece. We are a community center open to all women from across the world, and our mission is to create a safe, participatory, and inclusive space in which women can feel safe, empowered, and supported in order to raise their voices and follow their dreams and chase after the dreams in order to bring the change they desire in their lives. And also we work very hard to change the false narrative, as Suranjana also said, about refugee and migrant women being the receivers and the victims. And we want to show to the broader community how powerful women can be and how many things can contribute to the local community if we allow them to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Lydia. Krishna, can I give you the floor, please?
Okay. Thank you, Mai. Hi, everybody. I hope you guys are doing great and glad to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. It's me, Krishna Khatka from Nepal, and I am a founder chairperson of YFIT Foundation, in short. And I am closely working with UNMGCI Migration Group Communication Team and Communication Coordinator for SAC Youth Platform as well. Like talking about my work and YFIT Foundations, actually I am a business background student, but still I have been working in this sector from past 5 years. And from past 3 years, I have been working by establishing the YFIT Foundations. We basically work for, as our name suggests, environment, education, and development. We are mostly working for the climate change, environmental conservations, educations, and development, where we promote social entrepreneurship, youth empowerment, and the other like policy and advocacies of the youth as well. We are the very group of young people and we're from the diverse background, and most of the things are like doing by a kind of each and trial kind of things as well from the organizations. But currently we are mostly focusing due to this COVID or other thing, we are mostly focusing on the series of things which we can transform virtually. And since this pandemic hits, we started webinar series very fastly, or started from the beginning, and we have been done more than 20-25 series of webinars, which mostly focus on the youth, for the youth. And we are prioritizing to take care of the, especially for the mental health, because like it has been, maybe I can say it has been talked a lot, or maybe I can say it hasn't been talked that much. But the thing is like other supports from the government or relief or everything's are still there, or many other individuals are also working on that. But the major things we underestimate is about the personal care or the feelings of individuals, which we skip, or maybe we ignore that. So we primarily focusing on that as well from our organizations. And we have been we used to run a project platform, which is kind of a platform for the individuals, people to do research or to learn on their ideas. And due to this pandemics or social distancing issues, we are not be able to do it on physically, so it gradually shifted to our virtually. So I don't know, like when it ends, or when we get to have a personal touch or the feelings of being together. But for now, yeah, we are trying as much as possible to be virtually and as productive as for the development of the youth in our country. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. We'll also touch upon the article that we had published from your organization that's working with youth initiatives, how they're restructuring their work during the pandemic as well. We'll come back to that later in the session. Now I'm going to come to you, Nadia.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's lovely to be here with everybody in multiple corners of the world that we're all joining this call from. So as Mahin said, I'm Nadia Sitas. I'm from the Center for Complex Systems and Transition, which is a research institute based at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And my work is mainly applied research with the focus on the interface between resilience and development in Southern Africa. And a lot of the work that I do focuses on issues related to equity and inclusion linked to the governance of shared resources. So this can be at a community level or between countries. So basically how to collectively govern resources. So things like water from rivers that are snaking through countries that provide the lifeblood for local activities, economies, and key natural processes that sustain those activities. So given that I'm a researcher and it's a research institution, we use a lot of theories and frameworks, but the ones that I use are linked to resilience and complexity and also intersectionality to try and understand systems and the interconnections between people and nature, and really to give a sense of where to intervene in those systems to try and untangle some of the complexity and challenges that societies face in order to make decisions that have more just outcomes for both people and natural systems that they depend on. So a lot of my work is a strong focus on understanding power dynamics that either burden or benefit certain groups or people. So we work on a variety of different projects. Some of them are development projects, some of them research projects. So we've got a USAID funded project that works in the Okavango and Limpopo River basins that look at transboundary governance. And then also another global challenge research project that looks at resilience and equity dimensions of horticultural value chains between Kenya, South Africa, and those are connected to major UK retailers, and how to manage cascading risks, especially linked to droughts, really to get a better understanding of who benefits and who loses out from these globally connected food systems. And a couple of other projects, but what I'm here to talk to you about today is work that emerged during the coronavirus, the crisis that unfolded in South Africa, which started off, as I'm sure it did in many other places, as the health crisis, but played out as this kind of cascading economic crisis as the lockdown continued, and really highlighted the existing fault lines. So it gave me an opportunity to think about how my work interfaces with relief activities and recovery work in neighborhoods where I live. And this was born through a whole lot of community action networks that emerged because of this crisis, that were phenomenal kind of emergent self-organizing coalitions for change. So I won't speak anymore because we'll dig into some of the details, I think, in the next session, linked to some questions. So thanks very much, very happy to be here.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you, everyone. So we are going to steer the conversation towards the pandemic a bit and how the organizations you're working for and your work has been restructured or reorganized to respond to the pandemic. So Lydia, why don't we start with you? Can you give us a little bit of background on how the pandemic has changed or led to a reorganization of the way the IRIDA Women's Center are working with women, refugees, and asylum seekers in the last few months?
Okay, so the pandemic definitely shaped our current way of operation and IRIDA's programming as we try to respond effectively and sufficiently to the new needs caused by COVID-19. Throughout the years, we call to respond to emergencies and indicate extreme resilience in challenging situations, while at the same time we try to maintain our flexibility as much as possible in order to respond to the current needs both of the community we serve and the broader local community. However, I will not hide that the COVID-19 pandemic was a strong shock, putting our community under a serious, unprecedented threat. And in early March, we took the hard but necessary decision to close our physical space, following the governmental regulations in order to protect our members. It was a very painful and demanding process, as IRIDA is a community center and our philosophy and working methods were based on openness to all women, physical presence to the space, and the personal interaction with our members. So we had to adjust our services during the lockdown regulations. Here, it worth to mention that we used to serve about 70 women on average basis per day, along plus their children, before the pandemic broke out. And thankfully, we managed to transfer most of our services online using digital tools. For example, we ensured that all our members could have access to the internet. We set 2 Facebook groups related with access to valid information and protection, respectively. We had Zoom classes in order to ensure that our community members would remain connected with education. And we even set like a YouTube channel in order to battle against the feeling of loneliness and boredom. And at the same time, we expanded the provision of our protection services as the needs were increased, since many actors in the field suspended their services 100%, leaving massive gaps behind. We remained closed until 31 of June, and now we have partially returned back to the normality following strictly the governmental regulations. And we have a very fresh and adjusted to the current needs programming. And of course, we have expanded our protection services. We cover emergency accommodation, we cover medical appointments, and we also offer legal counseling and support. And we have also added employability sessions and trainings, such as individual CV sessions, job counseling, labor rights in Greece, and so on. Thank you.
Okay, Lydia, I just wanted to ask you that one of the major occurrence during this pandemic has been a result of anxiety and fear among people all over the world. It's a very common feeling. And I just wanted to know what the local reaction was, because you are at the end of the day, dealing with asylum seekers and refugees from different parts of the world. Was there a reluctance? Was there some kind of social stigmatization? Did you have refugees coming in during the pandemic? What was the situation like?
Well, it was a very messed up situation, let's say, if we put it in simple words. And generally, the local population in Greece hasn't been very open and refugee friendly lately, even before the pandemic broke out. And the situation was worsened because of the pandemic. For example, we have observed racist behaviors and actions from local communities towards asylum seekers, and in many occasions, COVID-19 is used as an excuse to cover their actions. It's important to mention that Greece has been in the refugee crisis game, let's say, from 2015. So we have like some fluctuations in the way the local population deals with this issue. Thankfully, generally in Thessaloniki, the situation has been calmer with way fewer expressions of racism, stigmatization towards the refugee population. And of course, the pandemic brought on the surface issues and behaviors that were mainly related with prejudice and the false narrative of refugees and asylum seekers being the receivers in the host communities. And that's why we tried through some small projects to battle this narrative and break down the false image. For example, we had a cooking project run completely by our community members, and we were distributing on a weekly basis 200 portions of food to homeless people in Thessaloniki. So we try to change the perception, let's say, and to see how we can work together harmoniously without having our differences separating us, but our differences can connect us, because we believe that cultural diversity can eventually lead to great social change in a positive way and to amazing innovation.
Right. No, exactly. So despite all that has been going on, I mean, and we are yet to publish your story under Voices from the Frontline, it is evident that the community members are also serving and contributing to the society, which is in one way you have to do that to change perception. Which is quite an interesting point. So Krishna, I'll come to you with a question. Is in the article that we published, we talked about a few organizations that are doing very implementing innovative practices in Nepal. So one of the initiatives was Blue Waste to Value. Can you give us a little background on this Blue Waste to Value organization, and also how working online has affected youth initiatives such as BWV, and a little bit about the digital divide that has been prevalent during the pandemic as well?
Okay, thank you, Mike. Talking about the Blue Waste to Value, it's like a waste management company who has been working in the waste management from a couple of years. They generally try to call it the waste from the industrial waste, or waste from hotels, or even trekking or Himalayan areas, and they differentiate the waste and segregate the waste and reuse or manage that waste innovatively. But considering this pandemic situations, they're in starting the digital divide or online has been a significant challenges to them, because organization has been led by the youth. The manager or supervisors, people are well educated, they are well trained, but the those people who are working on the ground level are still illiterate, or they don't know about technologies, or they have not been practiced that. This pandemic hasn't stopped their work, because they have been practicing safety measures from the beginning of the day, because they are working with the waste. They have been working using PPEs, they have been glove, masks, or everything. But the problem has arise when for the communications or the supervisions, or when their manager has to order or assign the tasks, because they cannot meet every time due to the travel restrictions or the safety measures as well. So it has been very challenging. I came to hear that it has been very challenging to the Blue Waste to Value in order to manage their work daily routine schedule. So it has sometimes it has been affected or delayed their work as well, because of the technology. And what they did is they organized a small training, which has to those people who have been working remotely, try to find some other persons who can train them, or just literate them with the basic things so that they will be used to, or they will learn the process, and then they did a small training to their every individual workers, and they fill the gap for the digital divide by providing the basic trainings to their every employees. And now they are doing very well, and it has been like a really successful ideas for them as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. Nadia, in an upcoming blog in collaboration with the Voices from the Frontline as well as Thomson Reuters, you're one of the writers. You're co-authoring a piece for us, which is yet to be published. But I just wanted to bring in one of the points that you had mentioned is that you wrote about an old settlement in the Western Cape with a history of constant change linked to social engineering, forced relocation, and unjust policies and legislation imposed by the apartheid. Can you please elaborate about how local women came to the aid by operating community kitchens, which is actually one of the common threads between this story as well as Lydia's?
Sure, thanks. A lot of the work that I was involved in during the last couple of months was linked to these community action networks that kind of sprung up as these kind of emergent coalitions throughout Cape Town. It happened throughout South Africa as well. But the neighborhood where I live, Muizenberg, is connected to a whole lot of adjacent neighborhoods that aren't as well resourced. So when lockdown hit, I think there was an initial panic, how people, jobs stopped, income streams stopped, how are people going to access some of the support services that they needed in order to kind of stay healthy, stay safe. And so we partnered through Muizenberg CAN, we partnered with existing organizations in Vrygrond, which, as you said, is an old informal settlement in South Africa of around 40,000 people. Most of the people are still living with the legacy of apartheid. If we're talking about extremely resilient systems, this is a system that, South Africa has just not been able to kind of get right. And we really have been able to implement strategies to transform lives in the last 25 years since democracy. But why, understanding resilience is quite useful is because if we know what makes something resilient, we can understand where to intervene and break it and build new systems based on these ethics of care. And some of those seeds, we've seen all around us in the work that's been happening. So the movement was with local grassroots organizations. One was called Amava Aluntu, which was doing phenomenal stuff with youth in Vrygrond before the pandemic hit. And then very rapidly, this incredible movement led largely by women and youth. So they started this whole new movement called Vrygrond United for Change. And it started connecting people. A lot of it, as you said, was around food kitchens, but they did so much more. They did a whole lot of community mapping, which was going door to door saying, what do you have? What do you need? Are you able to, go to local stores? Who lives here? What is your health like? So this phenomenal map that sprung up before, very well-established neighborhoods were able to get on top of this. And I can share some resources in the chat for people to read. But also information about the virus, as other people have mentioned, incredible stigma that was linked to it as well. In these neighborhoods, it's a completely diverse mix of people, lots of foreign nationals that live there with varying, some of them are legal immigrants, some of them are legal, but xenophobic violence increased. So a lot of the work was centered around these kitchens. But how do you mobilize very rapidly when you aren't able to meet? So that was also a challenge, all of the stuff where, in a normal situation, you gather people, you start brainstorming ideas, but this was, really different circumstances, which, meant that people had to use technology and other ways of communicating with people. Also connecting some of the food flows. So, realizing that these big retailers, often some of the food flows stopped. So how can we connect small scale farmers to some of the retailers that they were normally supporting? Some of the restaurants closed down. So some incredible initiatives started. But in terms of the way that the youth and women collaborated, it was setting up about 17 new kitchens. They served about 200 meals a day, 5 days a week. So how do we get food to those spaces? How do we start making sure that we can procure from systems that are local, that are more sustainable? How can we keep this going? A really great thing that they started was called Uber Feeds instead of Uber Eats. So people aren't able, they don't have the tech to get food delivered to their house. So there were young people in the community that could move food between homes for people that weren't able to, were either sick or ill. So yeah, it was really important to do some of the community mapping to understand where some of those more kind of vulnerable households were, but really providing ongoing support. So there was, you know, some systems used the lockdown to do illegal evictions, gender violence spiked. So really making sure that people still had access to these vital resources. Also has been mentioned around access to education. Kids weren't going to school. How do you educate children when you don't have access to the internet, to technology that a lot of places in the world did have? So all things from setting up community gardens to make sure that actually there are these more local food supplies, thinking about energy security, so innovations in that space as well. So women that have to cook big meals aren't then depleting all of their energy sources. So there are these things called wonder bags, which basically kind of insulate meals and do the cooking for you. You can just kind of start the cooking and then set it to the side. So really trying to connect different people and different ideas. And a lot of the role that we played in this work is about leveraging our privilege and power and understanding about where resources lie in the system and how to kind of mobilize that effectively in ways that can sustain, you know, as this lockdown has changed from the different levels, people are moving around, how can we make sure that we don't go back to what it was? So really thinking about doing some network weaving, connecting people to systems. A lot of the support that was available is not available to, you know, to foreign nationals. So it was all only for South Africans. So how do you make sure that everybody that lives in South Africa can still access some of these resources? And it was largely by women in their homes, in their kind of lounges, which suddenly they would put gas burners, cook these meals 5 days a week, in addition to their existing loads of kind of caring for their family, of maybe possibly even doing a work if they are frontline workers in the healthcare sector as well. So yeah, really phenomenal work, but we will post some more information about that in the blog. And I'll also share a link to a really great video that came from some of the work that people can bookmark and watch later on.
Great, thank you. So one of the results of the initial lockdown imposition was food insecurity and access to food by the vulnerable, which has been witnessed around the world. And many stories that we have published, there's a very common theme of community gardening and community kitchens, and these community kitchens being mobilized by women, as well as the women are cooking and also making sure that people are getting access to food, especially the most vulnerable. I just wanted to bring in Suranjana here, because in order for women to implement these initiatives, there's a lot of resources that they have to mobilize before they can actually undertake this initiative. Suranjana, can you respond to the community kitchen initiatives by women?
I think that I want to say 2 or 3 different things. One is that the community kitchen work is it's attractive and it's something that has sprung up everywhere as part of the rapid response that women are doing. So they have quickly mobilized as groups and, you know, pooled their food resources and given it out. I think the more interesting thing actually is the community gardens, because I think that that's a very important and interesting phenomenon that I have been reading about, partly in the Voices from the Frontlines. There was a story in Dhaka, and poor people in Dhaka using vacant plots to grow nutritious food. And in our network, we have in the Philippines, we have community gardens which are being used. We have in India, women have since March encouraged their peers to plant vegetables in their kitchen gardens. And so by June, they were already harvesting these to ensure food security. And I've also been reading more about the ways in which cities expand and take over forest and farmland, and the community gardens and could be a way of creating more green spaces in cities in order to create more local access to food, as well as sort of reduce the carbon footprint of cities. So I think that and again, the community gardens is something that people that grassroots women have been doing continually on either in urban, peri-urban areas or small farms for years as part of their food security in relation to their climate work. So I think what we really have to understand is that this work needs to be seen in the context of development. And one of the sort of embedded things in the blog that we wrote about vulnerability of women versus the seeing women as drivers of change is really actually a bit of a critique of the humanitarian sector that has a very outsiders as the major form of assistance to people they classify as vulnerable. Because if you look at the way in which they classify the four groups, women, children, elderly, disabled, as vulnerable, putting all those groups together only works when you're actually an external person doing service provision to groups. That's when you say, okay, these four groups are not going to be able to access enough, healthcare or supply, whatever. And then otherwise, that kind of classification actually doesn't work at all. So, and the other reason that these, the idea of seeing a community kitchen, for example, just in that time frame of this emergency time frame of preparing, only looking at resilience purely as preparedness and response is hugely problematic, because partly that is what takes it out of the development discussion. You can actually, that's what our biggest problem is today, that the whole discussion on emergencies, the work on emergencies is being had in an isolated way, separated from everyday development. And the more we talk of it in a very short-term and short time frame way, the more that problem gets exacerbated.
Yes, absolutely. That's why we are publishing and talking about these stories of resilience, because the story that you were referring to from Dhaka was actually the community garden and the community kitchen that was created. We know that these initiatives already do exist in rural areas or even smaller cities, and this was a more urbanized concept in how one city dweller actually requested for permission from landowners to start gardening in these lands, so that the informal settlers in her neighborhood could come together, grow their own food, cook together, and then solve this food insecurity issue that they were facing. So thank you for that, Suranjana. We are running short of time, as is always the case with webinars. So we are going to move on to the question and answer session. I request participants and those who have joined us during the webinar, if you have any questions, you can either write them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand, turn on your audio and video, and ask a question to the speakers we have here today. We are going to hold this session for about 10 minutes before we move on to closing remarks, which will be provided by Megan Rowling.
Perhaps I could jump in to get the ball rolling, Mahin.
Great, yeah. Fantastic, Dion. Please go ahead.
Dion Nahia from the Global Resilience Partnership. Really inspired by what has been said by the panelists, and love the narrative of shifting that narrative from vulnerability to agency. So it's really, really inspiring to hear that from Suranjana and Nadia and others. I'm wondering how we make that stick. So my first part of my question is, do events like this that we've just been through help shift perceptions of the role, the leadership role of women in societies and communities? And second part of my question is, are there ways in which we can make those shifts stick, so that once we're through this crisis, that change in perception of the roles and the leadership that women and youth provide in societies, that sticks for the longer term?
I can take a stab at answering that. Yeah, I think that's something that's super important, and also in the work that we've been doing, and we've noticed that, some of it was just about emergency response, making sure people have access to resources, and the minute people, suddenly, you know, they can go back to their jobs. Some of that isn't needed anymore, but a lot of it is, you know, these problems were existing beforehand. And so I guess it is in that kind of the, how can we leverage networks and do some of the network weaving? Because when speaking to people in provincial government, you know, their money exists for supporting these initiatives, but you have to be a registered NPO, you have to have all sorts of, you know, jump through administrative hoops in order to access some of the funds. So how can we make sure that, you know, the people that are working on the ground, and phenomenal kind of youth especially, because I think just by the fact that they are youth, they immediately, people think that, you know, they don't have experience and they're not going to be able to administer funds in ways. How can we partner them with existing NGOs and existing NPOs to facilitate some of the work? And especially in the stuff that we've been doing, that's what we've been trying to do. So, you know, there's a phenomenal NGO that works with homeless communities. Obviously, you know, what happens to homeless communities during a crisis when no one's allowed to be on the streets, but there's an entire, you know, subset of our neighborhood that consists of homeless people. So working with those existing NGOs to leverage support, because they, you know, they've been in existence, they can access resources, and really start thinking of, they've got community centers, so how can those community centers also be set up as, you know, entrepreneurial hubs that, you know, youth can come to, can access information about furthering their education, but can also start thinking about setting up small businesses. And just link to that, you know, setting up a community kitchen and running a community kitchen is just like running a business. So how can we, you know, just do a bit more training to make sure that they can continue with running a restaurant afterwards. So it is trying to deepen. So not necessarily kind of like always, everyone wants to scale out and up, but really trying to scale kind of deep and try and work with some of the experience from local organizations, but also get them to partner so they can leverage funds.
Thank you, Nadia. I see Suranjana has her hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think an event is just to share some food for thought, get people to maybe rethink some of the assumptions and the ideas that they have. But I think for us in Wiro Commission, the way we think about change is to look at how do institutions, how do we challenge the ways in which they perceive grassroots organizations and grassroots leadership, and how do they affirm or challenge, you know, assumptions and roles in which they place these actors. Because, so for example, if you look at the idea of capacity building, every institution today in the government will say we need to do more work on capacity building of grassroots organizations. But if we shift that concept and say it's not just capacity building, it's actually learning by doing, which means that you have to put money in the hands of grassroots organizations so that they can test out solutions, whether those solutions are setting up a center which they manage themselves, or those solutions have to do with changing the way in which they do agriculture, or supporting them to have more conversations with different government institutions and negotiate their claims to different kinds of assets and resources. It doesn't matter. So I think what we are trying to do in the webinars where we are talking, I mean, is just to try and help us revisit some of our assumptions and concepts and frameworks. But I think when we look at the kind of progress we want to see, we want to, in the Wiro Commission, we want to talk about how do you see our roles and how are you going to recognize those roles and how are you going to resource or remunerate those roles.
Thank you, Suranjana. Thank you, Dion, for your question. Do we have any more questions? Anyone else would like to? If not, then I will ask a question. So this webinar is about, and also the Voices from the Frontline, we're talking about creating a new normal. We are trying to have a new way of thinking where resources are not allocated and distributed according to power structures. And we rebuild the decision-making process, which has more inclusivity and diversity. So two questions I have is, obviously there's the matter of perception when it comes to changing the narrative, but also what do you think may be a good start, seeing that we are reading and understanding about how women are disproportionately affected during crisis and the contribution that they are providing us with. What is a good start in terms of institutionalization apart from perception? And the other question is about youth. Like, how can these youth initiatives, which we are also seeing proliferated, how can they be sustained and encouraged and becomes documented for future crises? My question is open to all the panelists, and if anyone from the audience member also wants to come in, is more than welcome.
Okay, hello. I'll be answering the youth questions, most probably. Okay, talking about the youth initiatives and its sustainability. Like, basically, we are mostly focusing the youth or addressing today's youth because it has been a major agenda for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal as well. Like, what we always trying to say that you don't have to be an adult to be an active member of your community, or to be a voice riser, or to share your thoughts in the community or any kind of the places. Like, every individual person's opinions matter. And in the current scenario, we have been witnessing other large youth blondes in the history of the world. And there are very huge populations of the world as are the youth. And it makes very important to the world to engage every individual youth. And what, as a Whitefield Foundation or youth organization, we always try to include, or we always focus on youth to be a part of the policy making, youth to be a part of the decision making in every aspect, not only about youth empowerment or climate change, or in any kind of aspects. It might be a political, it might be a country's economy, or any kind of thing. So so that the every initiatives or every task current youth has doing will be addressed properly, and the visions prepared by them will be will be addressed properly in the future. So the most important and the first thing is to be they need to be a part of the every decision making. They need to be a part of the every activities along with the elders. That's the one of the major things we are focusing, and it need to be a mandatory to be a sustained youth initiatives. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. I see Megan has her hand up. Can I ask you to come in, Megan?
Hi, yes, I was just interested to know if and how any of you have worked with the media locally or nationally or internationally to tell some of the stories that you've been talking about here. I mean, beyond the Voices from Frontline project, which is great, but just more in terms of you know, traditional media. Have you had interest? Have you been able to engage?
I can say regarding IRI, the Women's Center, we take a huge advantage of our social media in order to spread the stories that we think they're quite empowering for the rest of the refugee community, but also can be a very nice message for the local community. And we always prefer to have the stories shared by the same beneficiary that has been benefited by our services. So we can see is like the best person to describe how she came in the center and how she felt safe, empowered, and eventually supported in order to grow and bloom. And coming to media in a more traditional way, like press or TV and stuff like this, we try to, you know, to increase, let's say, our voice to the traditional media. And we're very happy that some of those media share stories like these ones that we are discussing now. But it's very important to take into consideration the position that the government is holding, you know what I mean? Because in Greece at the moment, we are leaning towards a more anti-refugee position, and in many cases they prefer to present negative stories instead of positive that could bring unity and integration. And even like during the last months, they even recognized refugees as migrant, which is totally changed, the story. And we go back like so many steps back because we need to reclaim things that we thought that were like, fundamental from before. So it's a constant struggle, because we try to gain a positive view, but on the other hand, we have like so many obstacles on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, Megan, for your question. Since we started 5 minutes late, we're going to go over 5 minutes if everyone's okay with that. I think now I'm going to invite Megan Rowling to provide her closing remarks for the session. Just quickly, Megan is a Barcelona-based correspondent and editor with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. She has worked with the Thomson Reuters Foundation since 2005, specializing in humanitarian and development issues, including climate change and disaster risk reduction. Megan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maheen. Yes, and just to add that one of the reasons why I think I'm participating so enthusiastically in the webinar today, and I'm just privileged to be able to hear about the work that's being done by these organizations that you're speaking about, is just that we do not hear these stories anywhere near as much as we should in the international media, and also I think probably in national media. Local media may be a little bit different, but I speak mainly from the international media perspective because we are the charitable part of Reuters News, and we run our own news service which covers a range of subjects. We've done a lot in the past on humanitarian situations. We're now doing quite a lot on COVID, but we also have long-running coverage on women's rights and climate change, among other topics. I would not say, therefore, that we are what I would describe as typical media, because we have a mandate to focus on some of these issues. But I'll go back to that at the end. I was just going to say that, looking at the kind of global perspective, I think when it comes to COVID-19, we've had this line that's been trotted out that, countries run by women have done a better job at managing the pandemic. So, we hear the examples of New Zealand and Germany, and then we don't hear a great deal more in terms of what women are actually doing on the front lines in their communities, as you've been talking about. And earlier this week, I'm going to publish a piece fairly soon, hopefully, by Care International. They try to put a gender perspective on the pandemic, and as part of their work in a new report they've got out, they looked at the COVID response measures and the recovery measures that have been announced by governments, and I think they drilled down specifically to look at ones that are related to climate change or the green recovery as well, and they found that of about 350 that they looked at, none of them really have a gender perspective, which I find is quite shocking, because I don't know how governments think they're going to recover from COVID-19 if they aren't looking at the value and the contributions that women and youth can bring to this whole enterprise, which is so important. And starting by acknowledging the massive amount of work that has been done inside the home and outside the home by women, a lot of which has gone unreported, basically. And if governments don't take into account the major contributions that women can make, they won't recover as well. The recovery won't be as effective as it could be. And Care, for example, were pointing out, how in energy, for example, in clean energy, you know, women often can play a massive role in terms of delivering last mile kind of solar home systems or clean cooking stoves and that kind of thing to other community members. I mean, you know, I just think it's just a crying shame that you know, not more focus is put upon this. And in our work, we do try. And so we've run quite a lot of stories looking at individuals during the pandemic, whether it's teachers or you know, hospitality workers who've been struggling, or nurses in South Africa. But I think that one of the problems is finding the stories to tell. So I think that, you know, we have correspondents working in different parts of the world, including in South Africa. I think, you know, as part of what you're doing, I know you have so many things to do, and a lot of the work is not paid, or, you know, struggling for resources, but I do think it's really important to think about how to tell the story beyond you know, your immediate networks, because I think that can bring, it may not, and also I think what's important is to accept, maybe not accept, but to understand that all the coverage won't necessarily be positive. Even if there is a fantastic story to tell there, I think journalists are interested in getting a kind of nuanced view of the situation. So, you know, we never go into a story trying to find out, you know, what's gone wrong and you know, why something isn't working. But when I talk to journalists, and we work with a lot of freelance journalists on the ground in developing countries, you know, ask what have the problems been, what have been the obstacles to this project, what's missing, what's needed, because, you know, we need people to get a full picture so that some of the problems can potentially be better understood and overcome. And I think that's a really important part of resilience work as well, and all the questions that are being asked during this webinar as well about how can you take the learnings and then, you know, not have them just for this pandemic, but how can you help grassroots organisations build resilience in the communities beyond the pandemic. I think media can also contribute by, you know, showing what some of the issues have been. But it's sad when I hear what Lydia was saying about you've worked so hard to advance the narrative, and then we have xenophobia and we have people using it as a cover for racism. I mean, that kind of stuff is just really, really hard to, you can't accept that, and you have to keep fighting the battle. But when you've been fighting it for as long as you've already been fighting it, I think that's hard to hear. And I just hope that there are enough other media out there who are interested in not, you know, who want to work with you to not let that become the dominant narrative, and that we will see, we'll be able to leap forward when people no longer have a justification for this kind of thing. Anyway, those were just a few kind of general reflections. And just to pick up on what Suranjana said about, you know, this whole idea about vulnerability being something that's very much seen by people from the outside working in humanitarian emergency response. Yeah, I think absolutely the only way that we can get beyond that is to keep telling individual stories and reporting on the work that groups are doing, that just questions that narrative and that shows it to be too one-sided. And, you know, I think we've got these two kind of top-level narratives of women and youth being vulnerable, but then also they can be kind of superheroines or superheroes. But I think most people are kind of sitting in the middle somewhere, just dealing with the problems as they come along, and they don't see it in terms of these sort of big words and these concepts that are kind of imposed on them from the outside. So I think there's nothing more effective than just keeping on telling stories and trying to show what people are doing that basically questions those narratives. And I think at Thomson Reuters Foundation, we do try and do that. And because we have access to international kind of media channels, and all our stories go out on the Reuters Newswire, that we have over the years tried to change that, and that we have had some success in doing that, especially when it comes to climate change, I would say, Krishna. So for example, you know, we've really tried to tell the story of young climate activists, not just Greta, but lots of others, especially in Africa, Asia, and so on, who are telling their stories well via social media, but we can amplify that big time by picking up on those things in the mainstream media, and yeah, and I think that there has been a change, because now a lot of the things that we were reporting on as a kind of rare examples of reporting on these things, I don't know, say 5 to 10 years ago, you know, now I see last week around the climate strikes on last Friday, which was a year after the big actions, that Reuters is running a series on young climate activists. And you know, this is Reuters. This is, you know, we've done it already at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, but now we are seeing a lot of the mainstream media much more interested in the issues. In you know, there's a big shift in people talking about sustainability and you know, how do we live better together, and how do we address inequality? And these are the big questions that are being asked in the wake of the COVID pandemic. So I would say, don't be shy. Don't be shy. Don't assume that mainstream media are not interested in your story, because actually they probably are more interested than you realise. And if you can find a way to get to the journalists, you may well you know, find that they're interested to report on you and your work. So I would say go for it, and try and talk to journalists as much as possible. Don't be afraid. Don't you know, also be realistic about it. You know, that it may not all be 100% positive, but I think it's just very important to keep going. And you know, we have things like Voices from the Frontline, which is a brilliant series, and we're also running some blogs on our website, some op-eds, which are basically amplifying the lessons that are coming out of the Voices from the Frontline stories on the ICCCAD website. So we're just hoping to kind of, you know, get the message out there further, and yeah, we just have to keep at it, really. So kudos to everybody who's doing that work, and please just, yeah, do talk about it as much as possible, and get media interested, because I think things have changed, and I think journalists and TV stations and newspapers are a lot more willing and interested to tell these stories that you have, valuable stories that question the narratives.
Thank you, Megan, for that comprehensive overview. I think it's very important to get the media attention and to get the stories out there, but perhaps it's also very challenging to reach the journalists, or to get media engagement in your work. For those who are also doing the initiatives and also trying to get the exposure, it's also quite challenging. And maybe another webinar on how we can approach that would be fantastic sometime in the future. I just wanted to read something from Celine. She wanted to answer your question, Megan, earlier, that my own experience has been that media wants a hero. They often struggle to write about the work of social movements or a collective. We all also need consistent engagement, and not just when there is a crisis or something to celebrate. And that's absolutely, yes, that's true. Would you like to say something to that, Megan?
Yes, I just very briefly, I totally agree with you. I think there is this problem with media that you know, they'll get the story during a crisis, and then the crisis goes away, and then they forget about it, and they don't you know, want to tell that story anymore. And I think that is a problem. I don't know the answer except to say that, you know, stay in touch with journalists if they have come to you and they have told your story. Stay in touch, and when there's something interesting or new, let them know about it, and remind them, and you know, try and explain why the work you're doing is still relevant, how it's moved on. I just think, you know, sometimes journalists are very busy, especially at the moment, and you know, most are open to keeping the discussion going, and then looking for an opportunity. If you can provide them with a good opportunity, a news hook or something visual or something different, to come back and keep reporting on things, then, you know, some of them will take you up on it, some of them won't, but I say yes, it's worth a try.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar. I'm afraid we have ran a bit too late from the time, but I want to thank all the speakers for taking the time out, and all those who have participated and engaged with us. Till next time, we will see you again, and take care, good luck, and all the best.
And thank you, Mahin, for excellent moderation. Thank you, everyone. That was lovely.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Bye, everyone.